10 April 2022. A couple of things before we get started. First of all, the third and final exam for the semester is on the 10th of May 2022, and it will be from 11 o'clock until 12:20. So you have 80 minutes to complete the exam. There are a number of items posted. I have posted so far on Canvas the following for you. Let me find my list. First of all, I have a handout entitled Kant's Four Examples. These are in no particular order, by the way. You can see that this is two pages copied onto one sheet of paper. It's got a picture of Kant up here. These are Kant's own four examples, and we'll be talking about them in the next lecture. I've also posted a handout on Kant's first formulation. It's a little flowchart, and we'll go over that in a few minutes. I have posted a handout called My Philosophical Family Tree, which you may find amusing. And I've posted a couple of other items that we will get to in due course. I just wanted to get everything posted, but we're not ready to discuss them yet. Okay, today we're going to discuss two sections of Feldman's chapter 7. If you look at the reading list, you'll see that there are several sections in this chapter. We will be covering all of them. The sections in order are entitled Maxims, Universal Law, Willing, the Categorical Imperative, Kant's Four Examples, and More Examples. And we've already covered the first two sections. That was in the previous lecture. Those were entitled Maxims and Universal Law. Today we'll be covering Willing and the Categorical Imperative. And so that's two lectures. The third lecture will cover only the section entitled Kant's Four Examples, and that's where we will discuss these examples. And then we'll spend one day on what Feldman calls more examples, examples that he came up with, some of which he thinks pose a problem for Kant. Okay, so we have 4 days altogether on chapter 7. We will then move on to chapter 8, which is also on Kant, but we'll cover only one of the sections. I will at that time be posting some supplementary material from Kant. And that's what we'll be discussing when we get to that point. Okay, so let's get to it. I will cover these two sections today. From time to time, I will quote from the book, not too much though, and then I'll discuss it with you. Let's begin with this important concept of willing. What does it mean for Kant to will something? And it's unfortunate, but Kant was a poor writer. Kant was obviously very, very intelligent, and he had important things to say about ethics, but he was not a very good writer. And so for that reason, philosophers today still wonder what Kant meant. And philosophers also disagree among themselves about how best to interpret Kant. Now here, let me begin with a quotation from Kant. This is from a book that I'm sure you've never heard of and haven't read, but I have. It's a book entitled Lectures on Ethics, and it's a record of the ethics lectures that Kant presented when he was a professor. And most philosophers think it's pretty faithful to Kant's own views. Well, here's what Kant said in one of his lectures. He said, "To will is to have a desire which is within our own control. To wish is to have a desire which is not within our control." So Kant is here trying to distinguish between willing and wishing. They're not the same. And what he seems to be saying is that the difference between willing and wishing has to do with whether the thing in question is within your control. For example, I would like to win the lottery. When I buy a lottery ticket, I certainly hope to win. I know the chances are not good, but it is possible to win. Some people do win the lottery. So when I buy a ticket, I may wish that I win the lottery, but it sounds odd to say that I will to win the lottery. And I think the reason for that is we have no control over the numbers drawn by the lottery officials. Right? You can hope to win the lottery. You can wish that you win the lottery. You cannot, however, will to win the lottery. And I think that's because each of us as individuals has no control over the outcome of the lottery drawing. Unfortunately, what Kant says is still puzzling. You would think that this would clear it up. But as you will see, Kant thinks it makes sense to say things like this: I will that everyone keep his or her promises. Kant thinks that makes perfect sense, to will that everyone keep his or her promises. But that's odd because nobody has control over that. I, Keith, have no control whatsoever over whether everyone keeps his or her promises. I do have control over whether I, Keith, keep my own promises. That's within my control. So it makes sense to talk about me willing that I keep my promises. But it makes no sense or little sense to say that I'm willing that everyone keep his or her promises. So we've got a puzzle here, and I wish I could solve the puzzle for you, but unfortunately, philosophers to this day are still puzzled themselves about what Kant meant. Here is Feldman speaking from page 102 of the book. He says, to will that something be the case is more than to merely wish for it to be the case. A person might wish that there would be peace everywhere in the world. Yet, knowing that it is not within his power to bring about this wished-for state of affairs, he might refrain from willing that there be peace everywhere in the world. And now Feldman says, it's not easy to say just what a person does when he wills that something be the case. So Feldman speculates that willing for Kant is something like commanding yourself to make it the case. So when I will that my arm go up, okay, my arm is currently down, I'm going to will that my arm go up. That's the same, Feldman is suggesting, as commanding myself to make it the case that my arm go up. And I'm going to do that. Okay, I just commanded myself to make that the case. So maybe that will help. When you will something, according to Kant, you're commanding yourself to make it the case. Now, it's still puzzling how you can will that other people make things the case, or how will that other people do things, such as willing that everyone keep his or her promises, or willing that there be world peace. So I'm sorry that this is confusing. You can see that Feldman doesn't fully understand what Kant meant, and I don't fully understand it. Maybe no philosopher fully understands it. So what should we do about this? We need to understand what Kant means by willing, because he uses the term when he formulates his theory, which he calls the categorical imperative. So we can't just shove this aside and ignore it or forget about it. We have to grapple with this important concept. So maybe we should adopt the following approach. Kant seems to think that some things can be willed and some things cannot be willed. So let's explore that, as Feldman does. You know that you cannot simultaneously believe inconsistent things. I cannot believe both of the following things: that all bachelors are unmarried. Okay, that's the first thing. I cannot believe that and believe that some bachelors are married. You see that? Let me repeat. I cannot simultaneously believe both that all bachelors are unmarried and some bachelors are married. The reason I can't believe both of those is because they cannot both be true. Those two propositions are logically inconsistent. So if I were to try to believe both of them, I would have inconsistent beliefs. My beliefs would contradict one another if I were to try to believe both of those things. So we already have a notion of inconsistent believing. Let's now talk about inconsistent willing. Suppose I will both of the following. I will that I remain in motion, and I will that I remain standing without moving. Okay? I both will to move and I will not to move. Okay? Those two things cannot both be willed at the same time. They can be willed at different times. One of them can be willed, for example, at the current time, I can will that I be moving. You see my hands moving. At some later time, I can will that I remain unmoved. I can will that I remain standing or motionless. But you can't will both of those at the same time. If you did, you would be engaged in what Feldman calls inconsistent willing. You can't will contradictory things any more than you can believe contradictory things. Another form of inconsistent willing has to do not with logical impossibility, but with physical impossibility. So let's read Feldman's example on page 103. This is page 103 of the book. Remember, I have my book copied and in my notebook, so you don't see my actual book here in my hands. Once again, page 103. Feldman says, some of Kant's examples suggest that he held that inconsistency in willing can arise in a third way. This form of inconsistency is a bit more complex to describe. Suppose a person wills to be in Boston on Monday and also wills to be in San Francisco on Tuesday. Now let me interject. Those two things are not logically inconsistent in the same way that all bachelors are unmarried and some bachelors are married. Those two propositions are contradictory or inconsistent. They cannot both be true. But it can both be true that I be in Boston and that I be in San Francisco, but not, of course, at the same time. You can't be in two places at the same time, but you can be in two places at different times. Okay, continuing. Feldman says, suppose furthermore that because of certain foul-ups at the airport, it will be impossible for her to get from Boston to San Francisco on Tuesday. In this case, Kant would perhaps say that the person has willed inconsistently. So we've got some kind of physical impossibility here. You cannot simultaneously will, given the circumstances, that you be in Boston on Monday and in San Francisco on Tuesday. And that's because of the airport foul-up. So we've got at least two different types of inconsistency, logical and physical. And Kant's examples make use of both types. Are you still with me? So Kant is going to argue that in order for an act to be right, we have to be able consistently to will that its generalized maxim be a law of nature. In other words, we have to consistently will that the act be, or the maxim be universalized. And if it can't be, then the act is wrong. And you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to some of Kant's examples. It'll be much clearer. Now here's the final paragraph of that section. Here's Feldman talking. In general, we can say that a person wills inconsistently if he wills that P be the case and he wills that Q be the case, and it is impossible for P and Q to be the case together, either logically impossible or physically impossible. All right, so if you want some practical advice, you should will only those states of affairs or actions that can both be true. that can both be the case. If you ever will two things that cannot both be the case, then you have willed inconsistently. Now, let's go back a little bit in the book to the previous section and read some of Kant's quotations, because on page 99, we went over this the other day in my previous video. On page 99, Feldman quotes Kant. And here are 4 different ways Kant states the same theory or principle. And I'm going to read them again. Number 1, Kant says, I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Secondly, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Third, Kant says, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. And finally, Kant says we must be able to will that a maxim of our action should become a universal law. This is the general canon for all moral judgments of action. Now, this is the first of 3 formulations of what Kant calls the categorical imperative. We will be looking at one of the other 2 in chapter 8. Chapter 7 is concerned only with the first formulation. So we're going to stick to that right now just to keep it simple. It's still pretty complicated, but at least we're discussing only one of the 3 formulations. Okay? So let's turn, now that we have an understanding of what Kant means by willing, at least we think we do, let's turn to Kant's theory, which he calls the categorical imperative. And he usually capitalized it. Capital C, capital I. It's the name of his theory. He didn't call it egoism or utilitarianism with a capital E or capital U. He gave it his own special name. He calls the categorical imperative the supreme principle of morality. Now, it's not perfectly clear that Kant meant to be stating a theory that competes with utilitarianism or egoism. But Feldman and we are going to interpret Kant as providing a theory that is a direct competitor to act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, egoism, and every other normative ethical theory. Once again, Kant is not clear about what he's up to, about what he's doing. So let's turn to this section entitled the categorical imperative. Here's Feldman's formulation of Kant's theory. It's at the top of page 104. You can follow along. Feldman calls it CI sub 1. CI, of course, stands for categorical imperative, and the subscript 1 suggests that there's going to be at least one other formulation. And if you go down the page, if you go to page 105, nope, not 105, it should be in chapter 8, you'll see a second formulation of Kant's theory, and then later a third one. Okay, here's what Feldman says. An act is morally right if and only if the agent of the act can consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a law of nature. Now, as stated, this competes with act utilitarianism. Remember U sub 7? It also competes with egoism, which is E sub 1. And you can see that because it starts off the same way as those other theories. It starts off with an act is morally right if and only if. And then, of course, it fills in the rest in a different way. So all 3 of these theories, actually all 4, act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, egoism, and now Kant's theory, all of them begin with the same exact words. An act is morally right if and only if. Now, that's a lot of words, but you should now be in a position to put everything we've learned already together to help you understand it. Notice that in Feldman's formulation, the word maxim is used. We've already discussed what a maxim is for Kant. A maxim is the subjective principle of volition. It is sort of the principle under which you take yourself to be acting. Remember Grimbley and Hughes, Kant's examples? Each of them has a maxim for giving customers correct change. Their maxims differ, but their actions end up being exactly the same. And that shows you that the maxim is subjective and the acts themselves are objective. Okay, so what's going on in your mind is subjective, and that can differ among people, but the actions that flow from that volition can be the same, like giving your customers correct change. So we know what a maxim is. Secondly, we know what a generalized form of a maxim is. So suppose my maxim is, whenever I am tired, I shall sleep. That's my maxim. We can generalize that maxim by making it applicable to everyone. We can say, whenever anyone is tired or sleepy, he or she shall sleep. So generalizing a maxim just means making it general, making it applicable to everyone. So what Kant seems to be saying is this: whenever you're thinking about doing something, first of all, make your maxim explicit. Formulate it and make it self-conscious. Ask yourself, what is my maxim? What would be the maxim of my action if I were to perform it? Second step, generalize it. And once you've generalized it, you have to ask yourself a yes or no question. And that is, can I consistently will that the generalized form of my maxim be a universal law of nature? In other words, to take a few of the words away, am I able to universalize my maxim? To universalize your maxim means to make it applicable to everyone, to make it a universal law of nature, and specifically to will that it be a universal law of nature. So really what Kant is asking us to do is always ask the following question: what if everyone did what I'm proposing to do? Would I want that? Could I will that? And if the answer is no, I cannot will it, then it would be wrong for me to perform the act as well. More than anything else, Kant is opposed to making exceptions for yourself. If you can't will that everyone do what you're about to do, then you have no business doing it either, and it would be wrong for you to do it. If you can't will that everyone cheat on his or her taxes, then you shouldn't cheat on your taxes. So Kant wants you always to ask that question: what if everyone did it? How would I think about that? What would I think about that? Could I will it? Would I want it? And if the answer is no, then you shouldn't do it either. Now let's turn to this handout. I said I'd come back to it. Now it's a little bit clumsy pointing to things. I have to get my finger in the right place. Let's begin with the box over here on the far left. Okay, it says the following. It says, is the generalized form of the maxim of your proposed act capable of being a universal law? Okay? Notice it says nothing yet about willing. The first question you ask is not about what can be willed. It's a question about what can be the case. So you ask yourself, when you're proposing to act, can the generalized form of my maxim be a universal law? And that's a yes or no question. Suppose the answer is no. If the generalized form of my maxim cannot even be a universal law, then it would be wrong to perform that act. So if you look at the box down here at the bottom in the middle column, you'll see the answer no to the first question. And then I wrote the following: if the answer to that question is no, your proposed act is wrong. And by wrong, Kant would say contrary to duty. Remember, Kant believed that duty is the main concept of ethics, and that's what makes him a deontologist. That word is spelled Deontologist, deontologist. It's related to the word deontology. It just means that Kant is a duty-based theory. Kant thinks that duty is the key concept of ethics, and all the other concepts are derived from that key concept. Now, Kant goes on to give a couple of examples of this. Examples where the maxim cannot even be universalized. And we're not going to talk about those examples yet because that'll be the topic for next time from this handout. Okay? Now let's go back. What if we end up here where the answer to the first question is yes? What if the generalized form of the maxim of our act can be a universal law of nature? In that case, we have to ask another question. We have to ask another question before we can determine whether the act is right or wrong. Here is that question. Can you consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of your proposed act be a universal law? Notice we've got the concept of a will now involved. In this box, this is about what can be the case, objectively speaking. This is about what can be willed, subjectively speaking. Now, this is a yes or no question as well, and the answers are up here. The yes answer is in this box, and the no answer is down below, right here. So let's take them one at a time. What if the answer is no to the second question? What if you cannot consistently will that the generalized form of your maxim be a universal law of nature? Then, as you might guess, the action is wrong. It, once again, is contrary to duty. Kant gives two examples of this, and they're both listed in the box here, way over here, and we'll talk about them next time. Okay, I don't want to complicate things right now. Now, finally, what if we answer that second question yes? What if we end up here? Let's read it together. If the generalized form of the maxim of your act not only can be a universal law of nature, but you can consistently will that it be a universal law of nature, then your proposed act is right. It is in accordance with duty. You would be doing the right thing if you then were to perform it. An example would be something like borrowing money with the intention of repaying it. Right? You can, the generalized form of the maxim of that act can be a universal law of nature, and not only that, but you can consistently will it. In fact, I will will it right now, and I believe I'm doing so consistently. I hereby will that everyone who borrows money with the intention of repaying it does indeed repay it. I can consistently will that. I think that would be a good world, in fact, where everyone who borrows money repays it, and everyone who makes a promise to repay money does indeed keep that promise. Okay, so of the three boxes on this flowchart, two of them end up with the result that the act is wrong. Only one of the boxes ends up with the result that the act is right. So it's a two-part test. Kant is in effect saying to everyone, your action is right if and only if two conditions are satisfied. The first condition is objective. The maxim of your act must be able to be a universal law of nature. Secondly, and this one is subjective, you have to be able to will that the maxim, the generalized form of the maxim, be a law of nature. So I hope this handout helps you understand Kant. It sets out a two-part test for an action to be right. And we'll come back to it next time when we look at Kant's four examples. Okay, in the rest of this section, Feldman takes up a couple of interesting interpretive questions. Sometimes Kant seems to think that, or suggests that what we're really concerned with is choosing maxims. And Feldman resists this interpretation because other things Kant says suggest that he wants a theory of the rightness of individual concrete actions, a theory that competes directly with act utilitarianism. And part of Feldman's reason for saying this is that Kant has some disparaging things to say about utilitarianism. And that suggests that Kant wanted to come up with an alternative to that theory. And he believes that his categorical imperative is an alternative or a competitor or a rival of utilitarianism. Another school of thought says that universalizability is a necessary condition of rightness and not a sufficient condition of rightness. But again, Feldman resists that interpretation. Feldman cites other things Kant says to show that Kant had in mind both a necessary and a sufficient condition of rightness. And that's exactly what utilitarianism does. Utilitarians say that in order for an act to be right, it must maximize utility. Okay, and also, if any particular act does maximize utility, it is therefore right. So it's if and only if. Okay? It's both a necessary and a sufficient condition. And the final thing Feldman discusses is the difference between Kant's categorical imperative and the golden rule. Have you ever heard of the golden rule? I bet you have. The golden rule occurs in many different religious traditions. It is a very old rule. It's been formulated in different ways. One of the most popular formulations is, and here I will refer to what Feldman says. He says, the golden rule has been formulated in a wide variety of ways. He says that on page 105. And here is how Feldman formulates it. An act is morally right if and only if, in performing it, the agent refrains from treating others in ways in which he would not want others to treat him. So the idea is something like this. You should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or maybe we could put it in a negative way. Don't do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. So the idea is that you should conduct yourself in accordance with what you would want other people to do or not do to you. If I wouldn't want other people to punch me in the face, then I shouldn't punch people in the face, however much I may want to or be tempted to. If I would want other people to repay loans to me, then I should repay loans to them, loans that I've taken out from them. So I'm sure by now you're familiar with the golden rule. You may have thought when you were reading Kant up until this point of the book that all Kant is doing is giving his own formulation of the golden rule. But most philosophers think that that's not true. In fact, Kant himself denied that he was simply restating the golden rule. Right? So if Kant of course knew about the golden rule. He was given a very religious upbringing by his parents. And of course, he would have been exposed to the golden rule many, many times in his life. And Kant himself said that my theory, Kant's theory, is not the same as the golden rule. It's similar, it has similarities, yes, but it's not identical. And Feldman tries to explain the difference on page 105. The golden rule would allow actions to be performed where, for some reason, the agent would not mind being mistreated. For example, suppose I'm a proponent of small government. Those people are sometimes called libertarians. right? They want maximal individual freedom. And so they want government to be very small and compact, and they want government not to intervene in our lives. They want government not to regulate the economy and things like that. Now, suppose I'm a libertarian. I'm a rugged individualist. I believe that individuals should provide for themselves. Individuals should take responsibility for their own well-being and not look to the government for assistance and not look to other people for assistance. Let's call that rugged individualism. Now, the golden rule would say to someone like that, ask yourself whether you would want other people to treat you the way you're thinking of treating them. The rugged individualist would say, should I help other people? And the rugged individualist might say, that depends on whether I would want other people to help me. If I would want other people to help me when I'm in need, then I should help them when they're in need. But in fact, the rugged individualist would probably say, no, I do not want other people to help me when I'm in need. That's my responsibility to figure out a way to provide for myself. So the reasoning goes like this. Remember, this is a rugged individualist. This is not everyone, but only someone like that. The rugged individualist says, I subscribe to the golden rule. I'm considering not helping these needy people, but I want to do the right thing. So I ask myself, in accordance with the golden rule, would I want other people to help me if I were in need? And the rugged individualist says, no, I would not. I would want to fend for myself, take care of myself, provide for myself. Therefore, I have no obligation morally to help other people in need. So the golden rule would seem to suggest that rugged individualists have no obligation to help the needy. Now, Kant rejects that. Kant says that everyone has an obligation to help the needy. If you have more resources than you need, then you should give of yourself to those who have fewer resources than they need, especially people who are needy through no fault of their own, people who have had bad luck or have suffered injuries or illnesses that were beyond their control, for which they are not responsible. So Kant gives examples where his theory produces different results from the golden rule. Now, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. Kant is not saying that his categorical imperative always disagrees with the golden rule. What he's saying is something weaker than that. He's saying my theory, the categorical imperative, does not always agree with the golden rule. Let me say that again. Kant is not saying that the two theories are completely separate, that they always give different results. What he's saying is that they don't always give the same results, which means that they overlap, but not totally. And you see I've got my hands partially overlapping. So all Kant is saying is my theory, which he calls the categorical imperative, is not identical to the golden rule. They're different theories. They have different implications in certain cases. Okay, so Feldman discusses the golden rule, and here's how he puts it on page 106 at the end of this section. Feldman says, the main difference between GR, or the golden rule, and CI sub 1, which is Kant's first formulation of his categorical imperative, seems to be this, the main difference. According to the golden rule, what makes an act right is the fact that the agent would not object to having it done to himself. This opens the door to incorrect results in cases in which the agent, for some unexpected reason, would not object to being mistreated. According to CI sub 1, which is Kant's theory, what makes an act right is the fact that the agent's maxim in performing it can be universalized. Thus, even if he would not object to being mistreated by others, his mistreatment of them may be wrong simply because it would be irrational to will that everyone should mistreat others in the same way. So, if I may add my own gloss to what Feldman just said, the golden rule is too narrow. The golden rule tells the agent to ask, what would I want others to do to me? Right? Would I want others to do to me what I'm thinking of doing to them? Kant's response to that is too narrow. You've got to ask a broader question. What if everyone did it? Could I will that? Not just this one other person I'm interacting with or thinking of harming, but everyone. So that's the difference between the golden rule and Kant's theory. Of course, it would be nice if Kant elaborated. One of the maddening things about reading Kant is he writes unclearly about things that are very important. He sometimes doesn't give enough examples to illustrate what he's saying. And sometimes he doesn't clarify differences. He could have said more to clarify the difference between his theory and the golden rule. So what that means is that philosophers today end up quibbling with one another. One philosopher says, I think Kant means this, and some other philosopher says, no, I disagree with you. I've read the same passage from Kant, and I think Kant means something else. So these are interpretive squabbles, interpretive disagreements. And sometimes I wonder whether Kant did it on purpose. What better way to get people 100 or 200 years after you die to still be talking about you and your work? Now, I'm only being a little bit impish when I suggest that, but Kant could not have done a better job of getting people to talk about his ethical writings than by writing in such an obscure way, because that all but ensures that subsequent generations of philosophers will continue to read what he wrote and debate it and interpret it and discuss it and write books and articles about it. As for why anybody bothers with Kant, the answer to that is clear. Kant was obviously a genius. He had a great deal of important things to say about ethics and many other fields. So we can't ignore him. We have much to learn from Kant. But that assumes that we can ever gain an understanding of what he meant. And that's where the problem lies. Okay, it was a short lecture today. Now you may have realized that this lecture is being recorded now. The other lectures you've watched this semester were recorded a year ago during COVID. And I've been posting them for you. For some reason, the lecture for this material got lost. I can't find it. It's not in my YouTube channel, so I had to do a fresh lecture for you. I'll get it posted later today. And all the other lectures are available on YouTube, but I will post them one at a time for you. So let me just tell you what will occur. Once I get this video processed, I'll post it today, which is Sunday, the 10th of April, 2022. Tomorrow, I will post the video for the next section, which is entitled Kant's Four Examples. And that will be one of the older videos from a year ago. And I usually post something on Monday and Wednesday. Okay, the semester is winding down. We have only a few more days. Remember, I am in the classroom on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Almost nobody has been coming to class, which is fine, but you're welcome to come. If you do come, since I've already posted the lecture, we will have a discussion. You can ask questions. We'll make use of our time one way or the other. If nobody comes, which has happened several times this semester, that's fine as well. I'll stay in the room. I have reading material. I will definitely occupy my time. So make up your own decision. Make your own decision about whether to come to class. It's 11 o'clock to 12:20 on Tuesday and Thursdays. It's in room 200 of Preston Hall. Okay, that's it for today. I'm going to close this up and get it processed and posted. See you next time.